More people have joined the waiting room. We're going to let them in.
We're live.
Yep, we're live on YouTube, and we're joining on there. Okay, and we will record. Yeah, more people are signing on. Let's record to the cloud as well. We're also recording. Okay, so just as I'm gonna put everyone on mute, but again, you're allowed to unmute yourself if there's any clarification or any questions that you may have, or any follow-up questions. There was an opportunity to submit questions in advance of tonight's shiur. So, but if you did not do so, and you have any questions in advance or based on anything that we talk about, you're welcome to use the chat box. I'll be checking it on occasion throughout the presentation, and make it available. And also you can unmute yourself if there's any questions, anything you want clarified. I'm actually going to start with an interesting question that's not the Shabbos kitchen per se, but a Shabbos topic that was brought to my attention. I did a little bit of research on, and that was a question that I was asked concerning a carpet sweeper. Can you use a carpet sweeper on Shabbos? Carpet sweeper are one of those mechanical contraptions with two brushes on the inside, right? It's kind of like you ever see a crumb sweeper for the top of your tablecloth? It's a similar idea for your carpet. It picks up dirt, but mostly crumbs. And the question is are there any Shabbos issues with using one? Obviously, the Sabbath observant home, the only day you would want to use one of these carpet sweepers is on Shabbos, because the rest of the week you pull up your vacuum and you do a much better job with an electric vacuum cleaner. But the idea would be if there's crumbs or something on a carpet, and to pick them up in a non-electronic way, a mechanical fashion through a carpet sweeper, is that okay? So let's go through some of the little bit of instead of just yes or no, let's just give a little bit of background, a little bit of learning, some of the issues that are brought up as to what the potential problem may be with a carpet sweeper include the fact that when you run over the area, it may, with the brushes moving, it may rip up fibers from the carpet, and that may be a problem of the malacha, one of the 39 categories of forbidden labor, of ripping. You're ripping something apart. Now, the reason why that may not be the case, why that may not be a problem here, is because on a Torah, on a biblical level, the prohibition of korea, of ripping, is when you have two substances that are stapled or glued together that you rip apart. Even then, the only time it's biblically prohibited is when it's ripped apart for the purposes of tying or korea almanat litzfor, it's called in the rabbinic literature. It's ripping apart for the purposes of putting back together in a more solid, more sustained fashion. That's obviously not what's happening here when you are going over the carpet to pull up the crumbs, and it may inadvertently rip some of the fibers of the carpet. If anything, you certainly don't want that to happen because it's damaging the carpet, but you're willing to take that risk because you want to clean the crumbs. So it's certainly not a rabbinic prohibition of korea, because you're not doing it in order to glue the pieces together. It's not two separate items that are being ripped apart, and it's done in a way that ruins the carpet more. It's not a constructive act. As we know, all 39 categories of forbidden labor are framed on a biblical level as a constructive act. Even demolition is a like soter or korea is only a Torah level prohibition when it's done in the context of building or repairing or strengthening the connections of those items. So since none of that is true here, the potential problem that you might think when it comes to a carpet sweeper of Korea does not apply. What about the Shulchan Aruch mentions that you're not allowed to shake dirt off of a garment. That is called a tolda, a derivation, an extension of the prohibition of malabin. Malabin literally is cleaning something, right? Let's say you have a stain and you clean it off, you rub it out with some sort of abrasive or some sort of soap. That's a Torah level prohibition of malabin. But there's a rabbinic extension of that, which is shaking dirt off of a garment. Now, even though the Shulchan Aruch says that this is a problem, and so shaking dirt off a garment might be similar to removing dirt from a carpet, right? Maybe we should consider that similar. Now, it's true that Ramosha Isserlis, the Ramah, for whom Ashkenazic Jewry looks to for halachic, for the final word in matters related to Jewish law, says only that it's a stringency. Tov lachush. It's a good idea to be concerned that shaking out a garment and in that way removing the dirt is a violation of a rabbinic prohibition of malabin. But on the essential level, ikar hadin, it would not be prohibited. Now, the other problem with comparing using a carpet sweeper on our carpets with the rabbinic prohibition of malabin is that the prohibition of malabin primarily applies to a new garment or a very clean garment, and you have dirt on it, you wouldn't wear it that way. And so by flicking the dirt off it, you have prepared that garment for wearing or for use. Number one, carpets, the reason why I use a carpet sweeper is not to remove all the dirt, right? All the dirt is still going to be there. The purpose of a carpet sweeper is to remove the large particles of dirt or crumbs or food residue that may have fallen on the carpet underneath your dining room table or in your kitchen, whatever the case, the living room, crumbs, whatever the case may be. And therefore, it does not fit into the model for the prohibition of malabin. Furthermore, if we're dealing with a carpet that is permanent, right, like a full room carpet, that would have the halachic category of mechubar l'karka. It's connected to the ground. It's no longer considered like a beged, right? Like a sheet or a blanket is considered a beged. If you have a sheet that has four corners, you have to put tzitzis on it. Maybe not a sheet, but a blanket. You have a blanket with four 90-degree corners. There may be and you wear that blanket on occasion. There may be a requirement for tzitzis, right? So because that's a beged, but a carpet that's glued down, stapled down, nailed down to the floor does not have is not eligible for the category of beged, but is rather eligible for the category of mechubar l'karka, and that doesn't have the laws of malabin associated with it. So number one, is it Korea? It's not Korea. Number two, is it malabin? It's not malabin. A third problem that people suggest that some of the poskim say is that it's uvda dechol. Now, this is a very broad category in halachic literature, of course, concerning mundane weekday activities engaged in on Shabbos. and it finds sometimes if halachic deciders have a sense that something should be avoided on Shabbos, but they can't find the category of forbidden labor that it falls in, they'll use sort of the umbrella category of uvda dechol. Rav Avadia Yosef is quoted as holding that using a toothbrush, a regular toothbrush on Shabbos, is a violation of uvda dechol. Right? It's what we use on weekdays. He wasn't, some people say you can't do it because you're rubbing the cream. He said that's not the problem. And some people say you may cause your gums to bleed. He said that's not the problem. He said, what's the problem? The problem is uvda dechol. It's a weekday activity, and Shabbos should be unique. So how do you? So a carpet sweeper may be something that people use on weekdays. Although, of course, sort of the counter argument to that would be Orthodox Jews only use carpet sweepers on Saturdays. It's our special Shabbos carpet sweeper because during the rest of the week, if we need to clean our carpets, we plug in a vacuum cleaner and do it the right way. So that's the counter argument, and in fact, that's when Rav Ovadia Yosef says that brushing teeth is a problem, a violation of Uvda Dechol. His remedy for that is have a special Shabbos toothbrush, right? Because the activity in and of itself is not prohibited based on any category of labor. It's just something you do every day that you should avoid doing in the same weekday fashion on Shabbos. And the remedy is you have a Shabbos toothbrush. So if you abide by all of the psakim of Rav Ovadia Yosef, it's good to have a Shabbos toothbrush. I imagine some Judaica store somewhere in a stronghold of Rav Ovadia Yosef sells toothbrushes that say like Shabbat Shalom on them. If not, I have $1 million idea for anyone who wants to go ahead and go that route. But so the same thing would be here. Certainly, those of us who utilize carpet sweepers primarily, if not exclusively, on Shabbos, there wouldn't be a problem of Uvda Dechol. The last possibility, the last possible category would be muksa. In what way would it be muksa? If the carpet sweeper within it already contained dirt from before Shabbos or from the previous Shabbos, perhaps you're not allowed to move, right? The prohibition of muksa, right? We talk about touching, but really you're allowed to touch muksa, right? Don't tell anyone, right? You're allowed to touch muksa. The problem with muksa, right, which are those items that are used only that have no permitted Shabbos use to them, is picking them up and moving them. Touching them, it's not accurate to say. Moving them is the problem. So if this carpet sweeper has dirt in it already, maybe we should consider it to be muksa because of the dirt that is contained therein. So the counter argument to that is that at worst, you have an item that is both has an element of muksa to it and a permitted element, utility to it, right? And generally speaking, those types of items, right? Like you think about the tray of Shabbos candles, that after the candles burn out, there's no use for those candles, and therefore the tray is prohibited to be moved. It's muksa. However, if you have a beer cone, you have a bencher, you have a sitter, you have something that you can use on Shabbos on the tray, you're allowed to pick up the tray with the extinguished Shabbos candles in addition to the bencher, because it's a basis of davar hamutar v'davar aser. It's a foundation for something that's prohibited to be moved due to muksa, but also items that are permitted to be used. And therefore, we don't say across the board it's prohibited. And here too, we might say that as well. There may be some dirt associated with it that makes it muksa, but the rest of the item, the mechanical carpet sweeper, is still usable and therefore may be okay. A number of contemporary 20th century halachic deciders ruled stringently not to use a carpet sweeper. However, the Nishmat Shabbat, which is Nishmat Shabbat, is a relatively newcomer to the literature, of compendiums of halachic practice for the laws of Shabbat. You may be familiar with earlier renditions of this. For instance, Shmirat Shabbat Kehilchata, which was the go-to, especially because it was translated into English by Rabbi Yeshua Neuwirth. So the next generation of that literature, the Nishmat Shabbat, says that it's okay. It would be okay to use a carpet sweeper on Shabbos on your carpets to clean up. Again, one last caveat being that you're doing it for Shabbos purposes. Right, you're cleaning up. We're going to see this hopefully when we get to a different shaila. You can't sweep the carpet for Sunday on Shabbos, right? You're not allowed to prepare on Shabbos for the weekdays. But if somebody made a mess on Saturday and either you're having company over Saturday afternoon, still Shabbos, or it just bothers you, right? For the honor of Shabbos, you want the room to be neat, and there's crumbs from lunch, there's crumbs from a snack, then it would seem to be permissible. I would advise, if anyone asks me, that a carpet sweeper, although some are stringent not to use one, there seems to be plenty of room to permit such a device for use in order to clean up on Shabbos itself. Moving on, I wanted to talk a little bit about crock pots. Crock pots is a topic that I receive a lot of questions about, and it's one of the easier ways to heat up food, to keep food hot, or even to heat up food. You use the top of the crock pot. At the Weinstock house now, from my understanding, if you want to warm something up on Shabbos, on Shabbos day, the top of the crock pot is hotter than the hot plate that we have. Go figure. That's what I've been told. And experience seems to show that out. So we know that we're not allowed to cook or bake on Shabbat, and yet there is a very strong custom mandate to eat hot food on Shabbat. So that seems to be a contradiction. You can't cook, and you're supposed to eat hot food, right? So the answer is, so long you're supposed to utilize fire cooking implements that have been prepared in advance of Shabbos, right? That was left on from before Shabbos, and you have to prepare the setting so that you don't come to manipulate the fire on Shabbos. It's one of the differences between Shabbat and Yom Tov. On Yom Tov, you're allowed to manipulate the fire, turn it up, turn it down. You're not allowed to turn it off. You're not allowed to turn it on. On Yom Tov, on Shabbos, you're not allowed to manipulate the fire either. Everything has to be set up in advance, including the fact that the food should be cooked to a degree that we're not concerned that you're going to go back and manipulate the fire so that it'll cook more quickly over Shabbat, right? So it has to be halfway cooked, a quarter of the way cooked, a third of the, whatever the case may be, in order to ensure that the food will be hot, but the food will be cooked, and you don't have to mess around, manipulate the fire. So one of the easy ways to do that nowadays is the crock pot. So how must we prepare ourselves, especially if you want a stew or a cholent or chamin or whatever it is that you like to eat from a crock pot on Shabbat day? What are the steps we have to utilize in order to prepare that crock pot to be appropriately set and ready for Shabbos? So number one is that the food in the crock pot should be partially cooked in advance of Shabbos. You shouldn't turn your crock pot on a minute before Shabbos. How long does it take? You know, I usually say if you have your crock pot on a couple of hours before Shabbos, you'll see that the food is somewhat cooked by the time you light Shabbos candles. Right? So that should be the plan. And again, the idea being is that it's now, might there be some wiggle room by a crock pot because you basically set it and forget it? Maybe, but certainly lechatchila, initially when we're planning to use a crock pot, we should plan to put the food in the crock pot a couple of hours before Shabbat begins, so that it'll have 12 plus hours to cook and we won't need to manipulate it in any way. Another thing we need to do is to ensure that that we won't forget that it's Shabbos and manipulate the fire, right? So this manifests itself in different ways, right? So for instance, on the old-fashioned or even on a gas stove, right? The old-fashioned gas stoves that were not glass tops, you would cover the fire, right? Cover the fire with a piece of tin, right? That was called a blech. You would cover the fire so that it accomplished two things. Number one, it accomplished the fact that it would be clear that you're not cooking in the normal fashion. You're heating up. You're allowing it to retain its heat, right? So it's not mechse kimavashal. It doesn't look like you're cooking on Shabbat. And the other point is that it's clear that you won't make the mistake of manipulating the fire. That's also something we have to take into consideration. So what about by crock pot? How does this manifest itself? So in order to ensure that we don't manipulate the fire, or that we are reminded not to manipulate the fire, the recommendation is to cover the knob with aluminum foil, or to tape the knob, or to take off the knob, depending on what type of slow cooker you have, some way indicating, making it difficult or a pause before anyone would change this setting of that thermostat. There are those who suggest that just as, by the way, this is, if we'll deal with crock pots and hot plates at the same time, right? In Israel, they call them platos. In America, you often see a Shabbos hot plate. It's a way of heating food Friday, Shabbos morning for the Shabbos afternoon meal, right? So there too, if it is a hot plate that has different settings, one of the steps in order to prepare it for Shabbos is to cover the knob. If there is no knob, it's just plug in. There's nothing to cover. You don't have to deal with that. There is a concern, let's say by a hot plate. Some hot plates can only be used for warming. Most hot plates, you could cook an egg on a hot plate. You could melt cheese. You can make a grilled cheese on a hot plate if you were so inclined. They get really hot. So there are those who hold, and I subscribe to the idea that in order to avoid mechse kimavasho on a hot plate that gets hot enough to theoretically cook, one should make some sort of hecker, some sort of indication that it's not being used for cooking, it's only being used for heating, reheating, right? That you're using food that's fully cooked and you're not using it to cook the food, just to heat the food. The way this is done is by using a layer of aluminum foil or by inverting baking sheets over the hot plate. These are some of the recommendations. There are differences of opinion. Some say this isn't necessary because it's a warming plate. Nobody uses it to cook. Nonetheless, in my experience, and the truth is that the Weinstocks do it partially halachically, but also practically. If we put our food up on a hot plate, directly on the hot plate itself, with just a layer of aluminum foil, and we go to shul and we come back 3 hours later, our food is burned. That's just the reality. So from that perspective, what we've adopted, and it's also based on this stringency, is to heat up our food Shabbos morning on inverted tins, inverted pans, or baking sheets. It doesn't have to be a lot of space. It just indicates that you're not using it to cook. You're using it to just warm up. Do you have to do that? Right? We said there's differences of opinion. My recommendation is to do that on a hot plate. You have to do that on a crock pot, right? So when it comes to a crock pot, there are those that say yes, that you should have you should cover the bottom of your crock pot, of the crock, between the crock and the heating element, right? Underneath the crock, right? The crock is the actual clay pot, and underneath is the heating element with some aluminum foil. Others disagree because you can't see it. You're not going to be able to see that, and therefore it doesn't alleviate any of that concern. And the visible thing is the knob, and if you cover the knob, that suffices. And so my recommendation is, when it comes to a crock pot, you should remove the knob or cover the knob or put a piece of tape on the knob, some way indicating that you're not going to change the temperature. It's not necessary to cover the inside with aluminum foil, but if you see that, if you've learned that, there certainly are those that recommend that as well. One last thing, which only Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was concerned with, most everyone else is not, is there's a prohibition of insulating food in a way that maintains or elevates the heat, right? So you can't, I'm jumping ahead, but like, for instance, an urn, right? Some people don't think that their hot water urn keeps the water hot enough. So they'd like to cover the entire thing in a sleeve. And so that can run into the prohibition of hatmana, which you're not allowed to even do before Shabbat. So even if it was a sleeve that completely encased the entirety of the urn, one would not be able, and it was ordered to maintain the heat of the hot water, one would not be allowed to do that even on Erev Shabbat, even before Shabbat started, for it to maintain the heat on Shabbat itself. So is there a concern, because the heating element of the crock pot is not just on the bottom like a hot plate, but curves up a little bit on the sides of the crock, do we consider that to be hatmana? Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach seems to be the only posek who held we should be concerned with that. And the way to alleviate that is to make a little bit of a space between the crock and the heating element, which can be accomplished by putting some rocks. If you've ever seen in people's homes, some people put rocks in the heating element, between the heating element and the crock, so that when you place the crock in, it doesn't lay flush against the heating element. It allows some space, and therefore you're alleviating the concern of hatmana. The consensus of poskim, the majority of halachic deciders, do not see that this is a concern, because it's not completely covered in all directions with the heating element. It's mostly on the bottom and a little bit on the sides, and therefore I don't require that or necessarily recommend that. But just so you know, if you ever see that's in fulfillment of the position of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who is concerned that a crock pot is a potential problem of hatmana, which is alleviated by making some space between the crock and the heating element. So that's crock pots and hot plates. Those are some of the questions that I've received in the past, incorporated with some of the questions I've received more recently. I wanted to take a moment. I've talked about this in the past, and it comes up in other classes, to talk a little bit about Sabbath mode. A Sabbath mode oven, you can find them. Some companies advertise that they have a Sabbath mode on their ovens, and so it's important to understand what you can do with a Sabbath mode oven and what you can't. And the truth of the matter is that a Sabbath mode oven is a misnomer. There's really not much that you can do with a Sabbath mode oven for Shabbat. It's primarily a Yom Tov feature. In other words, a Sabbath mode oven, you can change the temperature on a Sabbath mode oven when it's in Sabbath mode on holidays, on Yom Tov, not on Saturdays. I'm not sure why. There are the one feature that it has for Shabbat is related to the timer. That it won't beep or whatever the case may be. But for the most part, Sabbath mode is meant for Yom Tov use. If you set your oven for Sabbath mode, you're not allowed to change the temperature, even if the display doesn't immediately change the temperature. You would not be allowed. There's lots of things, right? It's all the restrictions of an oven remain in Sabbath mode. In what ways can you use an oven on Shabbat? I saw that was actually just mentioned in the chat. So obviously, if your oven turns off, right? If you have a timer and your oven turns off, or you turn off your oven immediately right before candle lighting, and your oven's hot but off, so of course you can open it and close it at your leisure because the oven's off. The problem is when the oven is on and you open the door of the oven. The problem is that when you open the door of an oven, it immediately the temperature gauge, the thermostat, immediately notices that there's cold air, and as a result, it immediately turns on the fire. Now, so that becomes a problem. However, the caveat is, if you take everything out of the oven when you open the oven door, it's okay, because the fact that the oven turns on again is of no consequence and no interest to you, because you have nothing left in the oven. So the general rule is that you can leave items in an oven, but you cannot put items into an oven on Shabbat. So if you put your there was a question about an overnight kugel. Great example, right? There's recipes for potato kugels that sit in your oven overnight at a low temperature, whatever, 250, 300 overnight. So 24 hours, 12, 24 hours later, right? So if you put that in your oven on before you light candles and you leave the oven closed, so long as you'd be allowed to open the oven to take out whatever was in the oven, but you would not be allowed to close the oven again with anything in there. Because anything that was left in the oven, once you opened it and closed it again, would be heated / improved / acted on with fire that was initiated on Shabbat, as opposed to if you take everything out, right? So it's a one shot, you get one shot. If your oven's on, you can put things in before Shabbos, and you can take them out one time over Shabbos, so long as everything comes out of the oven at that one shot. By the way, let's just talk about some of the other areas where this plays a role. I'm skipping around a little bit, but I hope that's okay. I think if there's any other questions, we could pick it up. We could pick it up there. Somebody asked about ein bishlach or bishul. Ein bishlach or bishul is a concept that doesn't have to do with means that doesn't have to do with the fact that you're cooking in the moment. In other words, the problem is that if you leave items in the oven after you turn on the oven, you're initiating fire, right? You've done a malacha. Now, the only reason why we don't care about the malacha is because, excuse me, if you take everything out of the oven, then it's a malacha that has no impact. But if you left items in the oven, it's not that it's the same. Bishul achar bishul applies to fire that's not being initiated. Right? The problem here is that there's a fire that's being initiated by your opening the oven, and if you leave things in and close the oven again, then then it's not about the cooking; it's about the initiating of the fire, which is a prohibition, which is a problematic if you're going to benefit from that act. Sabbath mode would not, as far as I know, the Sabbath modes that I'm familiar with would not impact this one and out type of situation. Now, one thing that I have heard of, I don't recommend it, but what I would recommend, again, if the oven is off, you can open it and close it as much as you want. But if the oven is on, right? Again, we're talking about where the oven is on. The oven is on, then you run. Then opening the oven should be the time. Whenever you open up the oven, that should be the only time that you take food out, and everything else should be. If you want certain things in the oven and certain things to remain hot, you may want to use a hot plate in addition to your oven in order to have these things. But if the oven is on, even in Sabbath mode, one, as far as I know, in terms of the Sabbath modes that I'm familiar with, one should not close the oven again with food in it once you've opened it. Some say, what if you leave it open a little bit? So I think there's a difference of opinion there. I think that whereas I think Rabbi Heinemann and the Star K may have some leniency there, I think for the most part, most halachists frown upon that and say it's a one-shot deal. If your oven is on, you're allowed to open it once, and when you close it, the oven at that point should be empty. And if you wanted to have food remain hot at different stages, then that's a good opportunity to maybe use a crock pot or a hot plate, the top of a crock pot or a hot plate for those different courses to keep them hot. I wanted to this idea that there's a problem when you open the oven door, the thermostat kicks in, and therefore we run an issue. By the way, there are those who struggle with this when you open your refrigerator. Right, forget about if you left, right? We're not talking about where there's a light that goes on when you open the refrigerator. Then you have a problem. Make sure your lights are off in your refrigerator before Shabbos, because otherwise you run into problems. Yeah, you may need to find a friendly non-Jew to help you out in that case. But when you open the refrigerator, at some point the thermostat reads that the air is that the refrigerator is getting warm, and at that point the compressor turns back on. So are you allowed to open a refrigerator door ever? Some suggest that you can only open a refrigerator door when the compressor is running already, because by opening the door, all you're doing is extending that which is happening anyway. The mainstream opinion is that so long as when you open the door, it doesn't immediately turn on a fan, it doesn't immediately turn off a fan, it doesn't immediately turn on the compressor, the thermostat doesn't immediately make a change, then it is permissible. However, it's important to know that on it's the one day a week I get to yell at my kids and tell them you can't stand in front of the refrigerator door trying to figure out what you want to eat. Right? I mean, like my kids during the week, all I know of them is from here down, their heads are like in the refrigerator looking at what there's to eat. Right? So on Shabbos, from a halachic perspective, you should decide what you want. You should open the refrigerator door. You should, no nonsense, get what you need and close it again. Because if you purposely left the door open long enough that it would absolutely 100%, no matter what, cause the compressor to turn on again, you do run into a potential Shabbos problem. Now, again, you didn't mean to, but if you left the door open for so long, then it's one of these things that was bound to happen. and therefore more problematic. So again, this has to do with the thermostat that's registering what's happening. Generally, you have some leeway, you have some time, seconds, maybe minutes, right, before the compressor is going to turn on. But you should keep your visits to the refrigerator door ajar as minimal as possible for a similar concern. Lastly, this comes up with a hot water urn. Some question, some wonder whether when I pump a water urn, does that and I open the spigot, right, so that the water comes out, so cool air is coming in. Does that cause the electrical element to reignite to warm up the water again? And the truth is, you can do experiments with your hot water urn. There's all types of kashrut. Some hot water urns are certified kosher. But even those that are not, you can manipulate, you can play with, and you can experiment with during the week to make sure that it's permissible on Shabbos. What are some of the things to note when it comes to a hot water urn? So one issue is, how does the water come out of the urn? Right? Is there a pump, or is it a electric button that causes it to escape? Right? The old-fashioned coffee urns. Right, you picked up the spigot, and that was all mechanical. It wasn't electric. In some pots nowadays, they have both. They have a button that electronically pushes the water up, and then there's the pump mechanism that uses that doesn't use electricity, but that uses forces of gravity, etc., to move things along. So obviously, you can't use the electric dispenser piece, but you practice it on Shabbos on weekdays and see. Does the pump work? The ones that are Sabbath mode, I think, disconnect or make the electronic part not work, and it only pumps. But if it's not Shabbos certified, it may be okay as well. Another issue that some people note is the water. Some urns indicate the water level with a little tube of water on the outside, indicating how much water is left on the inside of the urn. And the question is that water getting reheated every time you take water out, right? Kind of like the problem of a hot water heater on Shabbos. What's the problem of using hot water on Shabbos? Why can't I use hot water on Shabbos from my sink? Why can't I use hot water on Shabbos? So you can't use hot water on Shabbos not because of the hot water, right? In theory, every once in a while, I ask this question, and then they explain to me why it's not recommended. It's highly flammable. If you were to turn off if you were to close the entry valve into your hot water heater, right? So no cold water was entering your hot water heater, and you were just using the hot water that was already there from before Shabbos, right? Then you would then that would be permissible. You'd be allowed to use that. You can't. Please don't try this at home, because your house will explode. That's what they tell me. Right? You got to allow it to happen. Theoretically, if you were to disconnect your hot water heater and have hot water in your tank, right? I don't know, 30-gallon tank, right? You turn it off, you unplug it. It stays hot for 12 hours. There's no new water coming in, and even if there's new water coming in, it's not being heated. Well, actually, you'd have to close the spigot. You'd have to close the entry valve there as well, because cold water that mixed with hot water is a problem of bishul as well, right? But if you unplugged it and close the entry valve, whatever hot water is in there, have a good time. You could use it. But the problem with tankless water heaters is that every time you turn on the hot water, you're igniting the pilot or the flame in order to use it. And that's people ask me that question a lot. Yom Tov, is it possible to use a tankless water heater for hot water on Yom Tov? And it may depend if there's a pilot or not. An electric one may be more problematic, but it really depends on how it works. We're not talking about Yom Tov today, but that's the problem. The problem is the new water that comes in that's being replaced, that's replacing the hot water that's coming out of your sink. That's getting heated again, and that you're causing that automatically when you turn on your hot water in the sink. Cold water's coming in at the same time, and you're causing that water to heat. So what about when you have the indicator with water in it? Every time you take water out of the urn, the level of that water goes down. and it mixes. So the Stark supposedly did, there's an article about this on their website, they did experiments, and they showed that the mixing between the tube and the rest of the water is ongoing, and therefore the water never cools down, so that would not be a problem. But this idea, the possibility that when you open the when you pump the water and cold air comes in, does it cause the urn to reheat? Does the temperature go and the water go down so low that the thermostat kicks in again and reheats the water? So that you can check. For the most part, that doesn't happen. But again, you can try it during the week to make sure that that's not a Shabbos concern. But again, these are all similar issues, whether it's the oven opening the door and benefiting from the fact that the oven goes on due to the thermostat, or the refrigerator keeping the door open so long that it automatically, it for sure will re-engage the motor and the fan, the compressor, or the case of the or whether we have to be concerned with the urn that will be cooled off and therefore cause the urn to reheat. These are all a similar idea. We don't mean for it to happen, but it automatically might happen if there's no delay, and we're going to benefit from that reheating. Then it can become a problem. Okay, just a couple of other things, and then we'll open it up. Definitely don't want to go too long. People ask me about dishwashers on Shabbos. Well, first more directly, many dishwashers now have a timer on them. And so the question is, can I set my timer on my dishwasher for 11 o'clock at night, and therefore my and after the meal, I load them into the dishwasher. I go to bed at 10. By 7 a.m. the next morning, they're clean. I didn't do anything. I just put them in the dishwasher, right? So just to take a step back, you're allowed to wash dishes on Shabbos that you plan on using for Shabbos. So you're allowed to wash dishes Friday night that you want to use Shabbos day. Of course, you have to be worried about a few things. One of them is unless you prepared hot water in advance, use like a tub of hot water from somewhere in advance, you wouldn't be allowed to use the hot water in your sink, turn on the hot water because of what we discussed earlier. Also, in terms of sponges, you can't use a regular sponge. Squeezing out a sponge is at least a rabbinic prohibition, and therefore you have to use Shabbos sponges. Okay. What about a non-Jew? Can a non-Jew wash your dishes for you on Shabbos using hot water and a sponge? Right. So here already, the halacha is that when you hire a non-Jew to clean, let's say to clean up for you or whatever the case is, you're not allowed. Right. There's a rabbinic prohibition. Actually, I mean the Torah says that your slaves have to rest on Shabbos. Right. So you're not allowed. A non-Jew is not allowed to do for you something that you're not allowed to do for yourself, except under extenuating circumstances where the rabbi said, we're the ones that said that Amir al-Yakum, telling a non-Jew to do something, is prohibited. In extenuating circumstances, we may permit it. But I'm having Corona's over, hopefully soon, and I'm having 12 people for dinner, and I'm using all my dishes, and I want some dishes for the next day. And it's a lot of people, it's a lot of dishes. I hire someone to help me, a non-Jew to help me serve and to clean up. And part of the cleanup is to wash the dishes. Can the non-Jew, he or she wash the dishes? So I myself as a Jew am allowed to wash the dishes, right? In a permissible way. So the non-Jew is allowed to wash them. Does the non-Jew have to do it the same way I do it? So here already we say you can't tell the non-Jew to use hot water, but if the non-Jew chooses to wash them in a way that's more convenient for him or her, then you don't have to stop them from doing it. So that would apply, let's say, to washing the dishes. There are some limitations on that. So, for example, if you hired someone for Shabbat lunch, you're having a lot of people, And after Shabbat lunch, part of the cleanup is to notice that there are crumbs on the carpet, right? So I can clean the carpet with a carpet sweeper. Can the non-Jew clean it with a vacuum cleaner? So already there, you may want to say, well, what's the problem? They could use a carpet sweeper, they could use a vacuum. But there's an additional problem that the vacuum cleaner makes a lot of noise. And that's a category called avshamilta, that if there's a prohibited activity that makes noise, even if under other circumstances it might be permissible, there's a concern about allowing it in that case. So for instance, another place where avshamilta comes up is setting a TV on a timer, right? Setting a TV on a timer shouldn't be any different than setting a lights on a timer. But the major difference is, first of all, you might say it's not Shabbos day, right? It's an uvda dechol. Watching TV is something we do on Sundays, not on Saturdays. But beyond that, even when we allow you to perpetrate or to plan for a malacha to be performed in a permissible way, it becomes impermissible if there's a noise that's disturbing that's associated with that activity, even if orchestrated in a permissible way. I mentioned that last because that may play a role. So what about a dishwasher? Can a non-Jew put the dishes in a dishwasher? Right? By the way, there's a difference between, what about if you want to what about a Shabbos lunch? And can you wash your dishes Shabbos lunch for Sunday? The answer is no. You can't prepare on Shabbat for after Shabbat. What if you have no cups left, right? And all the cups were used for Shabbat lunch. So you can wash the cups because you may need a cup on Saturday afternoon. So actually sheet Shabbos afternoon, someone may come over. You may want to drink. So that would be permissible. But if it's just to get a head start for the weekend for Sunday, then that's not permissible. Now, the only place that this becomes a little bit more confusing and a little bit subjective is people who don't like to leave a mess, right? It's Saturday afternoon. It's 1:00. I finish lunch. There's a huge mess of dishes, right? I still have 6 hours left of Shabbat. And I just don't like, it's not right. So not me, right? I would just leave them in the sink. I wouldn't look at the sink and I'd be done and I'd be fine. I'll come back to it Saturday night and I'll finish cleaning up. Or I'll throw it in the dishwasher and never have to look at it until they're clean. Right? But some people just don't, the idea that there's a mess in their kitchen, in their sink, is a detriment to their Shabbat. It's a detriment to their Shabbos experience. If that's the case, then there may be room to permit tidying up, even though it's not directly, you need those utensils for Shabbos, but you need to do it in order to make your Shabbat more enjoyable for you. But again, it would have to be done in a permissible way. Going back to the dishwasher with a timer, right? So we know that setting things on a timer, by and large, Moshe Feinstein has some concerns with it, but on an essential level, is permissible if everything's set up in advance. You view as if the malacha was done when you set the timer, just with a delay. And here the delay, you set the timer for the dishwasher to go off to start running at 11:00. You load your dishwasher after Shabbat dinner at 8:00, right? So the malacha was done earlier in the day when you set your timer. Is this permissible? You put the dishwasher soap in, everything's set. Is this okay? So there's what the answer is. It would have been okay, except for the fact that the dishwasher will not start running until you lock it. And you're not going to lock it before Shabbat because you want to put in the dirty dishes that you use for your Friday night dinner meal. So what is causing the dishwasher, the hot water to start, the mechanical electricity to run through the dishwasher? It's when you close the dishwasher and you lock it. And then the timer will do what it needs to do at 10:00. Because that action that formally seals the deal for that malacha only occurs on Shabbat, I think the consensus and what I recommend, what I tell people is that as much as it would be nice to use your dishwasher on Shabbat, because of this problem, it's not permissible. There are those in Israel who hire a plumber or electrician and the reason why you have to lock it, of course, right, It's kind of like the reason why you have to lock your oven when it's on self-clean is a safety feature, right? So there are those who have figured out a way to circumvent the safety feature, right? And so that you don't need to lock your dishwasher in order for the timer to set it off at the predetermined time, which means, right? Which means that if you do that and you forget to close your dishwasher after your 8 o'clock dinner, and you go to sleep at 10 o'clock, whether the door is closed or not, the dishwasher will start running, right? And you'll wake up the next morning with a huge mess in your kitchen with all the water and the soap flying everywhere, right? So be careful. I don't know. It obviously would negate any warranty that you have. And it does seem to be a legitimate safety feature. But if you were to overcome that, then you may be able to do it. But barring that, it really would be an issue. It seems to be without that bypass, it seems to be a problem, an insurmountable problem. And even if you were to bypass that issue, another issue that's brought up is the fact that a dishwasher makes some noise, not a lot of noise, like a TV, but does make a hum, and maybe that would be prohibited, even if you were able to bypass the locking safety device in some way. Again, if there's any questions, feel free to ask. I was gonna just do a couple of real short things to round out the hour. In the following cases, can you spray whipped cream from a can? Is that a halachic? Is that a problem? So you should know that there's a difference of opinion. What could be the problem? Well, whipped cream in a can is liquid until you introduce the gas, and then it forms some sort of solid, right? The whipped cream is not liquid anymore. So there are those who are stringent and say that that's a prohibition of molded, of creating something, right? It's like bar soap, where the soap, where it lathers, right? And similarly, the prohibition would be on squirting a whipped cream can. However, Rav Schechter from Yeshiva University and others feel that it's not a permanent change in structure. If you were to squirt some whipped cream on a plate and leave it there for about 15, 20 seconds, it begins to melt. And therefore, since it's only a very short type of change, it would be permissible. And that's how I would hold. It would be permissible to squirt from a whipped cream can on Shabbos. What about using a peeler on Shabbos? Right, we sometimes hear that using a peeler is a prohibition of borer, right? Because when you use a peeler, you're separating the skin, the peel, from what you want. You're separating what you don't want from what you do want. You don't want the peel; it comes off. You do want the vegetable, and therefore, and furthermore, it is it's not a knife, right? It's an item that you're using exclusively for the purposes of borer, which perhaps is prohibited. So here, there's actually a difference between the consensus in America versus Israel. In Israel, they're pretty machmir on this, and if you wanted to peel something, they would, let's say you want to peel peel an apple, peel a cucumber, they would tell you to do it in advance or to use a knife, because when you peel with a knife, you take off more than just the outer layer. You take off some of the actual vegetable or fruit with it. In America, Moshe Feinstein had suggested that a peeler is just a specialized knife. But there's really no difference between a knife and a peeler, and it's permissible. Certainly, if you're with two caveats that most people agree to. In other words, if you do it right before your meal, right, where there's some leeway when it comes to some of the malachos in the kitchen, right? If you're doing it for borer, if you're doing it right now, right before the meal, and especially if you're peeling something where the peel itself is edible, right? So cucumber is a great example of that. Then certainly the consensus in America, and what I would suggest is that a peeler is in fact permitted to be used, especially if it's for immediate use, and especially if you're using it on something that the skin, that the peel is edible. Someone asked, you melt solids like chocolate or cheese on Shabbat? So there certainly melting solids into liquids is a problem. Even if it's at, that would be a problem of molid. Melting, again, certainly if you're introducing heat to the situation and it's melting, then that would be a problem. Melting ice is generally viewed as permissible, especially if you melt it in your cup. So the liquid becomes liquid. Melting an ice cube purposely in an empty cup is actually viewed as an area of dispute. Melting cheese, I believe, would be melting cheese. If you're doing it at, I'm thinking that it's a problem of Mexican mavashal, that it appears as if you're cooking, unless it melts at room temperature. But otherwise, if you're exposing it to heat, I would imagine that is problematic, just like melting chocolate. If you are going to, if perhaps maybe if you're going to melt chocolate into a cup of hot chocolate, right, where it's liquid into liquid, then that would be like the ice being melted into a cup of a liquid drink. There may be room for that. I would have to look at it a little bit more carefully, but there may be room to permit it there. But just to have chocolate, a double boiler or something, even if it's a cliche, I think that would be problematic. Any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself. That's basically the end of what I've prepared, or what some of the listeners and those who have called in and zoomed in have asked me. But feel free. Let's open it up. We're at the hour mark, so let's open it up to any issues or questions. Feel free to use the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself. But otherwise, we will wrap up. Again, always feel free to be in touch with myself, with Rabbi Freiberg. If there's any questions on these topics or any other topics related to the Shabbos kitchen, the Shabbos home, or even the kosher kitchen, which we talked about last time. But if there's no questions from the floor, I'm going to wish everyone a good evening. Stay tuned for upcoming Zoom events. The next halacha class that I'll probably have scheduled will be for Pesach. I know I'm not allowed to say the P word yet. The only P word that I'm allowed to say is Purim, but it's already in our lexicon. So that stay tuned for the details on when that will be scheduled. And there's lots of other classes leading up to Purim. Tomorrow, there's a class with Gila Fine at 11 a.m. YH.org/Lisa, during Lisa Barrett's normal slot. You got an email about that, as well as all the ongoing and special classes that are going on. I saw that there's a question about, let me just take two other questions. Can you freeze leftovers? It's a great question. Can you freeze leftovers? There could be an issue of hachana when it comes to freezing leftovers, unless it's ice cream or something that's going to melt without it. I think by and large, we say you should wait till after Shabbat to freeze leftovers, because you're freezing them unless you put it in the freezer Friday night and take it out Saturday morning. If you're freezing it for later on in the week, that would seem to be a problem of hachana preparing, unless for some reason it was going to go bad and and be a problem. I saw there's a Shabbat warming cabinet. So there's a Shabbat warming cabinet where the temperature does not get above Yad Soledet, which is the minimum temperature that's considered to be cooking. That type of warming chest or warming drawer, where you'd be allowed to put things in on Shabbos and take them out, and it doesn't have the status of an oven. I believe one is certified by the OU for Shabbos use. That's a separate category. That's not what we were talking about earlier, and that you would be allowed to put in and take out without taking everything out at once. Can you mix chocolate syrup in milk? I don't think it's a problem with Sovea. The only issue would be dyeing, and we don't say that dyeing food is an issue, certainly not for immediate consumption. And it's a liquid in a liquid that, without any heat. So I don't see any issue there. Enjoy your chocolate milk, and if you use par of soy milk, enjoy your chocolate milk after your meat meal. Okay.
Rabbi, one more question. Yes.
You can just unmute yourself.
Rabbi, I have a question. Yes. I asked you in the past about the Spiralizer, which is like a grater kind of thing.
Okay.
Because you said the peeler is allowed. Is that something similar? Or you said no at that time?
Right, so a spiralizer is a specialized, not, how does it work?
It's mechanical. You turn it and there's holes, and it's like a grater, kind of like
Right,
a
right,
yeah.
so I think it may be a problem of grading.
Grading is
But
not.
I could double check. It's not, it's very
Okay.
different. It's very different than the peeler, right? Because the peeler is,
Yeah, it's not peeling. It's using
right,
the
it's not
same
peeling.
material.
Right, so I think that I'm happy to double check. I think it is an issue of, that similar to grading, but I can double check that for you.
It is like a grater. Grater is not allowed?
Grader, by and large, it depends on how small the pieces are, but grading, grinding, grading
Oh, okay.
could be a problem.
Got it.
I see
Thanks.
something here about reheating vegetables cooked in water and drained on Shabbos. They're no longer in water, but they may be moist. So again, reheating solids, we didn't really get into this. I think Rabbi Freiberg, the last time he gave a shir, spent a lot of time on reheating liquids and solids and under what circumstances. And so that we look at it in its normal form, right? So if you have a piece of chicken that has a little bit of sauce attached to it, that when it's heated up, it'll melt, or some fat to it, we consider that to be a solid that can be reheated on Shabbos without a problem. The same thing would be probably about vegetables that were cooked in water, drained for the most part. Even if they're a little moist, we don't consider that to be a davar lach, and it would be permitted to warm it up on Shabbos. There's a question about warming drawers. A regular warming drawer, if I'm not mistaken, would have similar, maybe similar to a stove, but I would want to look into it. It may be useful if you have questions about warming drawers to send me which one it is. I believe when we talked about warming drawers, they may have more in common, unless the question is whether when you open it, the temperature drastically changes, like we talked about by a stove, or is it just set at a certain temperature, and when you open it, it gets cooler, but it doesn't reignite. So that may be the determining factor when it comes to a warming drawer. A warming drawer is like a hot plate, just closed on three sides. Then you could treat it like a hot plate, and you can put things on and off on Shabbat. If it's more like an oven, then there are some of these concerns that we talked about. So a lot of things nowadays depend on the mechanics, or the schematics of the actual appliance. But hopefully we've gone through some of the general principles that will help you navigate and ask some of the questions that are needed as we try to figure out the best way to use our appliances in a way that honors Shabbat. Okay. With that, have a wonderful evening and a wonderful week, and look forward to learning with you and seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.